I want to welcome you to Thrive in the Word. This is Wednesday, and you're making it through the week, and we're so glad. I hope that you've been listening to these podcasts because we're talking about wisdom. And one of the things that we need to understand is that there's types of wisdom. And James here is not talking about natural earthly wisdom. He's talking about the wisdom of God. How many of you know that the wisdom of God far exceeds our own human wisdom? When you think of the wisdom of God, you're thinking that an all-knowing God is now telling us how to apply his knowledge to a situation. Just think about that. He knows the beginning from the end. He knows how everything is going to work out. And then he says to you, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men freely. In other words, get your wisdom from God. Now, there's earthly wisdom, and we're going to talk about that. But James here is comparing godly wisdom to all other types of wisdom. Now, just again, think about it. God's wisdom is always superior. Now, sometimes God will ask you to do something, and you think, you know what, that is not smart. Sometimes obeying God is not smart as far as natural wisdom. I remember way back in 1991, our ministry was doing great, and God called us to move my family and myself to what was then called the Soviet Union. We moved to Latvia. There were people that told us, Leon, that is the dumbest thing. What do your ministry's growing here in the United States? Does not make any sense. Well, how many of you realize it was the wisdom of God that called us? It was the wisdom of God that was in operation in our lives, because you know what? We wouldn't be at where we're at today if we hadn't followed the wisdom of God. So we need to understand that sometimes the wisdom of God is going to be completely different than the wisdom of the world. Now, James here is talking. We're in verse number 15, and he says, this wisdom is not that which comes from above. Now, what wisdom is he talking about? He's talking about a wisdom that comes from selfish ambition, a wisdom that comes from bitter jealousy, a wisdom that comes from arrogance, and a wisdom that comes from lying against the truth. And he said, this wisdom is not from above. And then he goes on and he says, but, and he again describes that type of wisdom. It is earthly. Now, what's he talking about with earthly? He's talking about something that's just things that you've learned through experience. Earthly, and if you touch a hot stove, you're going to get wisdom. You're going to get the wisdom to not touch a hot stove again. That's earthly wisdom. It's not bad wisdom. It's just earthly wisdom. It is not superior to God's wisdom. God's wisdom is always superior. It's always superior to earthly wisdom. I hope you understand that. There are times when God says to do something, and earthly wisdom says, no, it's not going to work. But you know what? When you do it, then you find out the wisdom of God. I believe it was the Apostle James who actually wrote this, who actually went into the area of India, and he found Hindu priests. And the Hindu priest said, you prove to us your God. And James said, give me that. No, it was Thomas, excuse me. Thomas said, "Give me that cup of water." He said, "I'm going to throw this cup of water in the air and it's going to stand still. It's not going to fall." And those Hindu priests thought, what a crazy man. But you know what? Thomas took that cup of water, he threw it in the air, and that water stayed there suspended. And he led those Hindu priests to Jesus. What was that? That was God's wisdom over earthly wisdom. So sometimes we have earthly wisdom, and earthly wisdom is good, but it's not superior to God's wisdom. Then the next thing he says is natural wisdom. In the New American Standard, actually, this is a wisdom that comes from your soul. Now, this wisdom, this type of wisdom, is something you need to be careful of. Because how many of you know that if your soul is filled with fear, if your soul is filled with bitterness, if your soul is filled with envy and those things and jealousy, how many of you know then your soul is going to lead you in a way that's opposite of the wisdom of God? So the second type of wisdom that James is talking about, he's talking about the wisdom that comes from your soul. Now, how many of you have ever had a bad experience? How many of you have ever had a frightening experience? And you know what? You say, because of that experience, I will never do that again. I remember an experience I had on a small airplane. And I got off that small airplane. I actually kissed the Canadian ground when I landed. Do you know what I said? I'll never fly a small airplane again. And you know what? It was hindering my ministry. You see, that's soulish wisdom. The next type of wisdom, and the last one that we're going to talk about today, is demonic wisdom. This has as its source demons, demon spirits. You know, people constantly are getting into witchcraft, and they're looking to the wisdom of spiritual or spiritists. And you know what? That wisdom is purely demonic. And it's something that will destroy your life. You know, that kind of stuff was going on during the time of James. It was going on, and James is saying, that is not God's wisdom. It's different. And so James is telling us here in this verse, there's three types of wisdom. And all three of these types of wisdom are not the wisdom of God. There's earthly wisdom, there's soulish wisdom, and there's demonic wisdom. Now we're going to continue our study in the book of James in our next podcast. Join us, please. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.